everybody.
Morning.
So I'm going to remind you that the meeting is videotaped and will be posted on IBO's website. And we also wanted to start the meeting by welcoming 2 new board members. So first we have Karim Hudson, who is filling the slot of an officer of a business corporation. He's the founder of the Genesis Companies, which is a development and construction firm specializing in financing complex affordable housing transactions in New York and New Jersey. So welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome.
And we also have Mark Page, who's filling the slot of a former director of the Office of Management and Budget. And Mark, as you know, was the OMB director in the Bloomberg administration from 2002 to 2014. So welcome, Mark. And maybe we can go around the room and introduce ourselves. I'm Jennifer March, the Executive Director of Citizens Bank for Children.
I'm Lisa Neary, General Counsel, IBO.
Karim Hudson, Genesis Companies.
I'm Flynn McCusty, Ziplin's Bulletin Group.
Wayne Ho, President CEO, Chinese American Planning Council.
I'm Tony Shores. I teach down at Princeton and work down at Princeton.
Mark Page.
Mark Canizaro, President, Council of School Supervisors and Administrators.
Deborah Golby, Hunter College. Rodney Lowenstein, IBO.
Michael Toomey, Public Advocate's Office.
Yao Usman, economist at IBO.
David Belgian, IBO economist.
Elizabeth Brown, IBO. Sarah Stransky, also IBO.
Justin the Black Controller's Office. George Switting, IBO. Michael Jacobs, IBO.
And we've got one more person.
Jonathan
Two more people.
Yeah. Jonathan Rosenberg, IBO.
And Doug Turetsky, IBO.
Great. So I guess the first order of business is approving the minutes from our March 29th meeting. So do I need to ask for a motion?
Yeah, sure.
Motion to approve?
Second.
Great. All in favor?
Aye.
Great. Super. So Ronald, it's all yours.
Okay, I'm going to keep the director's presentation quick. This is a lot of serious material we want to cover. But I needed to highlight a few personnel changes, just the bigger ones. Beth, who many of you know, who's been heading up our housing, environment, and infrastructure team, is stepping down to part-time to deal with 2 very small children and the cost of childcare. And in place of running the team, Beth is going to take over responsibility for our assessment of economic development incentives. A couple of years ago, Council passed legislation tasking IBO with evaluating these incentives. We're doing it in conjunction with the Council. We jointly agree on a topic for the year. And then we do the work. So this is the second go-round of that. Beth will be looking at the industrial incentive program, which is just what it sounds like. It provides tax breaks for industrial firms that remain in New York or expand in New York or start in New York. And we're in the last stages of the search for a replacement for Beth. Then the other big personnel change was Liza Pappas, who I think many of you know, has relocated with her spouse to Chicago. Liza did IBO's very first qualitative study in education, in which we looked at the impact of homelessness on school children. And I think of all of IBO's studies in recent years, I think it's had more of an impact than pretty much anything else. She's currently, despite being in Chicago, she's currently finishing up another study for us. This one, a mix of qualitative and quantitative methods. And she's doing that with big assists from Sarita Subramanian, head of our education team, and other team members. But the focus is on the provision of special education for elementary school students. And what Liza did while she was here was attended a number of meetings in elementary schools on individual students who were struggling and what the schools were planning to do to assist them, especially in light of the guidance to put them in the least restrictive setting. So she basically attended these meetings. Some of the meetings were a mix of administrators and teachers, general ed teachers, special ed teachers, psychologists, social workers, trying to grapple with these cases one by one. And obviously it's not about those particular kids, but basically what it was they were discussing and how many kids they discussed in a session and how it varied from one school to the next. So we're all working on that now. The only other thing I wanted to say is we've got some current and future advisory board vacancies that you guys are going to have to deal with. Deborah's term expired last spring, although she's graciously agreed to stick around.
Because it's so much fun.
The early mornings are refreshing, especially coming from Jersey.
The fresh air is just
wonderful. Right. Deborah currently occupies the slot for a current or former chair of a graduate school of economics in the city of New York. So if there's anyone here who can think of good candidates for that slot, we'd appreciate the recommendations. And meanwhile, we appreciate that Deborah's continuing to stay with us. And then we've got 2 slots that will be open next spring, both of which are actually currently vacant, in effect at least. One is for the former director of the New York State Division of Budget. Technically, John Cape is still filling the slot until next March, but John's no longer spending much time in New York City and hasn't been able to attend a meeting in quite some time. And then the other is for current or former dean of a graduate school of public policy in New York City. That was held until recently by Michelle DePass, who was the dean at the Milano School. She resigned from the Milano School after only a year there and moved to the West Coast and resigned from here as well. But because of the way the charter specifies the dates of the term, we don't want to replace her until next March when we can have someone serve for a full term. So we'll be looking for replacements for those 2 people as well. There are reasonable number of current and former policy school deans, but only a very limited number of former New York State Division of Budget directors. Lisa knows exactly where each of them is.
I have a list going back to the beginning.
Yes, they sent us a list to the beginning of state budget director. So we're going to be working to recruit someone. But there again, any ideas, we would appreciate them. And with that, I think we should turn to the agenda.
Great. So the first staff presentation is on New York City's shrinking Workweek, and it's David Felton.
I guess you just go to the second one at this point. So we worked on a couple of reports recently this spring and summer, where we found some unusual and I will argue somewhat worrisome trends in the city economy. The 2 reports, let me get those in, I'm supposed to before I go on, is Past's Prologue, Revised Histories and Extraordinary Trends in the New York City Economy, that was from May, and New York City's Incredible Shrinking Workweek. I like cultural references in the titles. That was in July. And the things we found was, first, that while the city's had record employment growth over the past decade, record for the city, it's been shadowed by declining average hours of work over the decade. And the second, and we'll see that it's related to the first, although it doesn't completely explain it, is that city employment growth has been increasingly dominated by one sector, home health care. So go ahead. Just a quick review, just to give you a sense of how, when you look at the standard measures, how just fantastic the city economy has been. This chart compares city employment growth over the last 3 business cycles. So you've got cumulative growth from the beginning of the cycle there, and this is months from the start of the cycle there. So the blue line is the January 90 through January 01 cycle, and then the next one, 01 to cut off in 08, and then the current cycle. without going through all the numbers, just eyeballing it, you can see we had a milder recession, surprisingly, while everybody else was going to pieces. Only lost 128,000 jobs in the recession, and it's been followed by just a spectacular employment growth, over 900,000 jobs. So the net over the cycle is over 800,000. You don't see anything like that as far back as you have numbers for the city. But, and here we come to the shadow, while all this growth has been going on, average hours worked, our average private sector's hours worked have been in steady decline in the city. This is average weekly hours here. The dotted lines are the monthlies. You can see there's a lot of volatility month to month. The dotted line is the trend, and the numbers are the annual averages. So you can see we were peaking at 35.5 before the recession began, dropped sharply in the recession, and continues to drop. We don't have all of 19 in, but it's probably going to land at 34 or below 34 hours per week. Go ahead. What this means is that if you measure how much labor or work the city's economy is actually using or supplying, if you measure it by head count, you get this Java update available. That's what you get. This is kind of a typical way of looking at it, and you see we've gained, this is annual average employment from 08 to 18, a 22% increase. But if you weight that by the change in the hours worked, which has dropped from 35.5 to 34.1, when you look at aggregate hours, or the total volume of labor, which is actually a standard international way of looking at this stuff, international accounts, the increase is only 17%. And we'll see that. Go ahead. It would be one thing if this was just going on around the country and the city was following the national trend, but it's not. What really kind of jumped out at me when I started digging into this is that the city has really kind of parted ways with a lot of the rest of the country on this. During the recession, everybody's hours dropped. It was an impact of the recession. But in the expansion since, in other metropolitan areas, in non-metro areas, in the total U.S., we see hours recovered, and generally recovered more than enough to make up for that hit. But in New York City, hours continued to drop. So we've gone from averaging substantially more hours than the rest of the U.S. as a whole to substantially less hours than the U.S. as a whole. So that's a big shift in the city's relative position. Go ahead. And it makes a difference in terms of when we put the city in the context of other metropolitan areas. Again, the standard way of looking at it is you rank by employment growth. Here are the fastest growing large metro areas. That's 1.5 million jobs or more. The city's right behind Dallas, Fort Worth, just ahead of San Francisco. So we're right up there. But you go to aggregate hours, and the city drops down to a very distant fifth in the ranking there. So we're not, our bragging rights are kind of diminished once you look at, not just counting heads, but counting hours that we employ people. So something different is going on here, and the question is, why is it going on? And there are kind of two broad dynamics that can account for this. Right, there you go. And you can either have hours dropping because the industry mix is changing. Hours work vary from sector to sector, and if the employment growth is in typical low hours work sectors, that in itself will drive the overall city average down. But you can also have drops at the actual industry and occupation level, and that will drive hours down even if there's no change in the mix. So what the city's got, go to the next, is a combination of both. This is ranked by average weekly hours. Now, I should say, these are not supplied by BLS. Most of the other numbers I've been supplying are from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, some with our own seasonal adjustments, blah, blah, blah. But BLS does not give average hours worked at the sector level below the state. But we do have the state, and we do have the city's shares of state employment, so with not too much massaging, I think I could get fairly decent kind of central estimates of our average hours at the city level. Yeah.
Are we talking about only employees who are paid by the hour, or are
No,
we also
all.
talking about salaried workers?
All. Everybody that counts in the current employment statistics. Yeah.
Does BLS survey employers or employees or both? How do they get
These are employer statistics. This is not from the household survey. These are all numbers from the employer survey. So, it's originally as the quarterly census of employment and wages, and then that's adjusted, the CES is adjusted to that, but this is all on the employer side.
So
Yeah.
salaried workers that are not on a clock.
It's all in there.
It's just by
How do you measure that? How do you measure that?
estimation, or?
Yeah, that's a good, I mean, this is part of what employers are reporting. So, yeah.
But do they report? If they report hours if they're salaried? Employers report hours for salaried workers?
Yeah.
What data do you have on
I
1099?
didn't know. Exactly.
Supposed to do.
What data do we have on employees?
That's not in this. I think for those, you have to go to the household survey side of it, and that would be, that's another one of those hanging out there fruit that I want to pluck, because the city's got a lot of self-employment, and there's not good data on it. That's another session.
And unfortunately, we can't get the 1099 just directly. The finance department hasn't. We could get some aggregates, but they'd have to generate it for us.
So, yeah.
So this is employers reporting employing people for fewer hours? It doesn't then capture that there could be an employee working multiple jobs?
No, but we've looked at that in the past, and others have looked at that, and there's no indication that that there's been much of a boost in multiple job count offsetting this at all. It's a small number. Yeah.
This is an aside, but has anyone ever compared reporting for salaried workers hours worked versus what the employer reports? I think there's at least the potential of employer bias.
The time use survey stuff, yeah, that would be. Of course, at IBO, it's always more than we actually. We're more than on the clock. So, but again, this is private sector, so I can't speak to that. It's a good question. I mean, but this is just what they're reporting.
I understand.
And I would just say that whatever biases are in there, they're probably not different in New York City than anywhere else. So that's yeah. So all right. Again, as I said, we've got a pretty large spread in average hours worked. This is ranked by 2008, so it goes from 42 hours in manufacturing, which nobody works in anymore, down to 29 hours in leisure and hospitality. But what you see is there's a general tendency for employment growth to be stronger in the sectors with the lowest hours. So if you average out this, it's 1.6% growth for this 38 hours and up group. It's 18 and 6.6% growth for this kind of middling hours work group. And for the low hours work group, it's 38% growth over the past 10 years. So we know that the change in the mix is part of the story here. But we also see significant drops within some sectors, particularly health and education services. And again, I should say that this is broad sector stuff. So even when you've got a big drop in hours at a sector level, there still could be changes in the mix going on inside that sector. And in fact, that's going to get us to the next one, because the education and health services story is really the story of one particular segment inside there, and that's home care, which is why I kind of mashed that in with this discussion. So we can go to that. Again, in education and healthcare, we've got the high employment growth, we've got the low average hours worked, we've got the biggest drop in average hours worked. So these are all channels for dragging down city hours overall. But within this sector, the employment growth has really been concentrated in home health care, and also the hours worked are particularly low in home health care and have probably been dropping significantly just in home health care. So that's kind of a segue into taking a little bit more of a look at that. So, as I said, we know that education and employment in general has been a very strong growth sector for the city, but home health has just dominated that. Since 2010, home health care jobs have doubled. They're now over 300,000, which is almost as much as you have in finance and insurance and retail and these other sectors. So it's big. But what you see in this channel, we've got annual growth, by the way, measured on a quarterly cumulative basis, quarterly average basis. And the red is home health care, just home health care, and the blue is everything else. Everything else. And we can see it's been pretty significant. It's been about 10% or so from 2010 to 2015. It was accounting for about a tenth, which is itself disproportionate. But from 2016 on, the share of growth that's home health is accounted for has exploded. Yes?
Are these employees or hours?
Employees. Now this is employment. We don't have hours at the city level, but we've got indirect indicators that the hours are low and that the hours have been dropping as this growth has been going on. But this is now employment.
And do you have a sense of why there's so much growth in this
Yeah,
sector?
Yeah, we do. I'll get to that. Yeah, right. Here we go. And this is by the way employment. It's in if you're NAICS mavens, if you know what NAICS are, it's home health care services and services for the elderly and disabled, because there's a lot of home care in the latter as well. Here, it's differs from state to state, but here there's a fair amount here. So 25% in 2016, 30% in 2017, 40% over the last year and a half of all the city employment growth. Flip to the next.
Wait, can we go back a second?
Yeah, go back.
Just to note that
This is-
2019 is,
Oh yeah, this is halfway through.
and unlike the other figures which have been revised, and generally the revisions have been upward in recent years,
Oh.
I wouldn't take that last number.
Oh, okay. I thought you didn't want me to. You didn't want me to say the B word. The B word is benchmarking. But anyway, these numbers get revised, and the revisions are they bedevil us often. But we expect that the revisions are probably going to raise the non-home health care employments by a fair amount in 18 and probably 19. It may raise the home care too, but I think it's going to raise the non-home a little bit more, information and stuff like that. But they're still going to be very high percentages. So when you go to the next, so when you look at just the last 3.5 years from 2016 on, home health related has gained 100,000 jobs. It's a third of all the job growth in the city. It's more than professional and business services, finance and insurance, and information combined It's more than, it's almost triple the amount that's in the rest of healthcare and education. It's more than trade and transportation. It's dominant. So, go ahead. So why do we care? Why do we care where the jobs are? They're jobs, right? Well, if you're interested in the strength of the city economy and if you're interested in the prospects for the city economy, I think it does matter, and I think this does have to be singled out. For one thing, most of this employment surge is Medicaid funded. Not all of it, but much of it. So when you're looking at a sector where the growth has suddenly exploded, and you know that it's exploded because programs have found a way to work Medicaid better, then that's really not, to me, an indication that the city economy is it doesn't add to the sense that the economy is strong. If you go back to that other one. Because if you look at growth without home care, well, you are looking more at stuff where you can say, this is economic growth. It's really gotten weaker over the past 3 years. If you don't make the distinction, it looks like, well, we're still really going gangbusters. But a lot more of that is now because of a program which is basically a Medicaid-driven program. So, yeah. The next one. And this gets back to the question that was raised. What's driving all this stuff specifically? It's not just home care. We can drill down a little bit further. And inside home care, there's something called the Consumer Directed Personal Assistance Program. I won't give the acronym, okay? I promise not to. But basically this is, you get to hire your relatives or your people in the community to do your personal care. And Medicaid, for the most part, this is Medicaid eligible stuff. And all that fast home care growth we were looking at before, the major part of that growth, the faster than that, is in this. The rest of home care has been growing fast, but this has been growing really fast. So, and if you've been, keeping score in Albany, you know that the state passed regulations that are intended to rein in this program. It's specifically to rein in fiscal intermediaries who are these, they act as co-employers because, at least in New York State, the way it works is if you hire your nephew, you don't do the payroll services for them directly. These fiscal intermediaries do the payroll services, and there are hundreds of them statewide, and the state is trying to, the state spends a lot of money reimbursing these guys, and so it's trying to change that. It's in the courts. The new regs are not supposed to affect actual eligibility for these personal assistants, but who knows? So we have a program. We have a big chunk of New York City employment being lifted by a sector which is Medicaid fueled, and in which the future of this, I think, will depend a lot on just how this court battle comes down and on how this stuff is regulated. And if you're someone who's trying to forecast the city economy, which is what we do, believe me, it makes it almost impossible to figure out where this stuff is going to go. And without this stuff, the city economy just doesn't look that strong. And then again, just to circle back, and if you factor in the hours work business, which this only explains part of, again, the city economy doesn't look that strong. So, that's the kind of stuff we start thinking about.
Yeah.
Piling up hours worked. And that's it. If any more questions, yeah.
How likely is it that the folks who are doing the personal friends or relatives caregiving probably have another job? I think I've seen some of that.
There's probably some of that.
So would that indicate even slower growth in the
Maybe. Well, again, in the
jobs?
employment statistics, every job is a job. Every job counts, whether it's a full-time job or a part-time job. If somebody's working two jobs are in those employer statistics. But it does look like there are fewer hours worked. I mean, in the folks who are being employed by fiscal intermediaries, we see the annual average wages are much lower, and they drop much faster than in the rest of home health care. And we know that the hourly benefits are roughly the same, so that, to me, that's an indirect indication that these are people who are not sort of like career home aides, but they're people who they're working for one person, and there are fewer hours. And as they become as they bulk larger in home care, it drives down home care hours and wages.
I mean, there's a slight difference though, where, for all transparency, I have a home care subsidiary as part of my shop.
I'm going to interview you.
And I'll use the acronym. So CDPAP workers have different salary parity laws than regular workers. So that could be part of the issue with their
I thought
salary.
they were pretty close, though. I mean,
they're close, but it's calculated slightly differently because those in traditional home care are union through 1199.
Oh, okay.
So the amount of the benefits is a little different than what we have to pay through CDPAP. And then secondly, and I don't know if you looked into this, is
but the benefits aren't even there. Yeah, but go ahead.
But that's the reason.
Right,
the
right.
benefits and offset.
Right.
If you have a lot of benefits, you don't get the salary parity
Right.
payouts.
Right.
So that's how it works out on the union side. The other thing is there's a growing number of 24-hour workers, but they're only compensated 13 hours. There's a court case and all this other stuff going on, but does the labor statistics only capture the 13 hours work because that's the official work hours, not
That's
the
a good question.
24-hour work cycle?
That's a good
I'm
question.
just going to raise exactly Mike's point, because if you look at that chart and it starts to blow up, that's about when some of the changes were made in the cap. So by definition, and that was not accidental, right? That was a deliberate effort to say people should work all those hours. Blah, blah. So whatever the merits of it were, we did start playing around with that around 17 or so. So it's not probably the driving force. I'm sure the secular trends are much more important, but there's something going on or tinkering with the hours as a regular.
Yeah, I'm really glad to hear this because I've been grappling with just those kinds of questions you're raising up, and only trying to get at it indirectly, but yeah.
I also want to just raise which I'm sure I'm going to get booed out of the room by several people on, but I just want to mention. Part of me has always viewed Medicaid as an export industry.
As what?
An export industry. Half the money comes from America. And so the extent to which our entitlement growth is pulling in half its dollars from the rest of the nation, I want to account for as New York State, some of which is us, but some of which is not us. It's at least half, if not more, is other people's money. So in that sense, although I appreciate your concern about the Medicaid thing, and it's always scary, and caps and all kinds of other things make it scary, in other respects, it's actually pulling in a lot of other people's dough.
Well, certainly the city does pull in dough from the rest of the state on this.
And the country.
And the country, yeah, absolutely. Interestingly, though, the home care growth is not and the home care growth is not as strong in the rest of the state as it is in the city. It's sort of borderline in Nassau and Westchester, but it's really much stronger in the city. And we looked at whether the CDPAP, whether the fiscal intermediaries, maybe they were addressed here, but they had employment, in Sullivan County or something like that. But for the most part, it seemed to be that the employment was here too. So, and I've been also working on interstate comparisons, which are hard because they don't treat this consistently from state to state. But the city's growth has been, it's really an outlier. But for me, the question is, how long? But thank you for that. Thank you for this.
Can I ask a question on the how long? Is any of this tied to the $8 billion in DSRIP money that came, in the state of New York? And no, it has no relationship to DSRIP at all. No.
Really mostly for hospital restoration. in the new round of district, there's a little more conversation about
kind of,
community
sort
forces
of,
driving health,
yeah.
maybe, but
Are there data available to break this out between salaried versus hourly employees? I mean, the reason I asked was the salary employee, if the number of hours worked is lower, that's a good thing, higher productivity. Okay. But if it's an hourly worker, fewer hours worked is a bad thing, because that's less welfare for them. I mean, economic welfare.
I don't, certainly not at a state or local level. There's a lot more industry detail for overall hours worked at the national level, but again, I don't know if they have those breakouts there.
Then let's move on. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for standing.
I'm ready for my own.
Okay. The next presentation is by another economist, Yao Owasu Ansa. Okay, so let me quickly set this up. We received a request from Manhattan Borough President Gail Brewer to look at the relationship between homeless shelters and prices of residential real estate. The results that Yao and Michael Jacobs found were, I think, scarcely surprising, but I think deeply uncomfortable for some of us. It elicited a great deal of pushback over the past week. I'm still not reading our Twitter account. From the administration, from shelter providers, for advocates for the homeless, and a lot of people we respect and who do hard work every day. But this is our answer. We stand by the report and its findings, and Yao's going to explain it to you. So thank you.
Good morning. So when some homeowners hear that there's going to be a shelter built in the neighborhood, they immediately start thinking about, oh my God, what's going to happen to the values of my home? But due to data limitations, we're not able to study the impact of homes when new shelter open in the neighborhood. Our study looked at whether there are any price differences between homes that are closer to existing shelter compared to homes that are farther away. So after controlling for all the factors that helps explain the variation in home prices, we find that homes close to shelter sold for about 6% to 7% less depending on the shelter type, and homes close to multiple shelters sold for about 17% less. So we're going to go into much detail what we mean by close to the shelters. So this table here represents the number of people in the homeless shelter system in New York City for fiscal year 2014 and fiscal year 2019. So for the last 5 fiscal years, the number has grown for about about 27%, with most of the growth in the single adult population. So in case you're wondering, so adult family shelters are used to house, for example, a husband and a wife or 2 siblings. Although the number has grown for about 27%, the budget for homeless shelter operations has more than doubled from $839 million to $1.85 billion the last 5 fiscal years. So this table here represents the number of facilities available to the city to use to house the homeless population. So there are 561 facilities, and most of the facilities are what we call congregate shelters. So congregate shelter is defined as facilities that are purposely built to house the homeless population, or facilities that are altered to fully house the homeless population. So you'll be wondering, why do we have a hotel under this sector? So these are the hotels that the city has completely taken over, and they are using the entire rooms as homes for the homeless population. So there aren't a lot of spaces in these congregate shelters. So what the city has done over the last several years is to increasingly rely on cluster sites and other hotels. So cluster sites are when the city rents an apartment or several apartments in an apartment complex to house the homeless population. So the city has been spending on average about $178 a night on the hotels, which translates to about $5,000 a month. So this is costing the city a lot of money.
Can I ask for clarification? So congregate housing essentially means the whole building is for homeless.
The entire building.
And
yes.
Cluster sites means a few apartments
A few
in the building
apartments,
are
yes.
for homeless.
A few apartments. It could be as few as one apartment or as many as the entire apartment.
Congregate's usually purpose-built.
Purpose-built, yes. So it's been costing the city a lot of money the last several years to rely on the cluster sites in the hotels. So the current administration is trying to move away from the cluster sites in the hotels and build more congregate shelters, which are, comparably wise, is cheaper to run. So there is no New York City specific study on the impact of shelters on homes close to the shelters. So the closest study we could find was the Fairman Institute study that looked at the impact of supportive housing on homes close to the supportive housing. So supportive housing is a little bit different from shelters. So for supportive housing, unlike shelters which provide transitional housing, supportive housing is actually permanent. The residents actually sign leases to live there permanently. So they did not find any negative impact on the surrounding homes. What Fairman had was that they had an information about when the supportive housing became operational. So they were able to look at, the changes of home prices before the supportive housing was built and the changes in home prices after the supportive housing became operational. And we would have loved to do something similar. So we would have loved to look at, what are the changes, in home prices before the shelter became operational and the changes in home prices after the shelter became operational. But Department of Homeless Services said that they did not have any data on when the shelters became operational.
Can I just pause you there? I don't understand this.
Well, they said, so I even offered that, even if it's on paper, I will go there, photocopy everything, bring it back here and figure out, how I can get it. They said they don't have it.
The most they could do is go back to 2014.
2014.
With the new administration.
And there were no records kept in prior administration.
I mean, so some of the congregate shelters have been open for a long time.
Yes.
They were destroyed.
Destroyed.
December 31st, 2013.
They're trying. They told us they were trying to go back, and now they can verify some that maybe opened in 2012. But even then,
But not before that.
and not before that. But even then, they said definitely we got it to 2014. We've got some we can verify opened between 2012 and 2014. So that's the best they told us they could do. Post-publication report conversation we had with them.
And then, just out of curiosity, why not try the 13, 14, 15?
We would try. This is post after we published. We were going to publish it. Then they told us that, we have 14, we could possibly go back to 12.
When we made the original request to them, they said they had nothing.
Yes.
Even from 14, 15?
Mm-hmm. So we will go back. We've asked them to give us.
Subpoena power?
No.
We've asked them to give us the data, and we will go back and look at, before and after. Yes.
They, somewhat suggestively, they said after the publication that if we had told them what we were doing, they would have given us more data. But
They would have had it.
they would have had it.
Yeah. They would have opened the other door.
So what did we do? Given the data limitations. So we looked at, we compared prices of homes close to Manhattan congregate shelters with prices of homes that are further away. So we had to rely on other data sources to try to verify operation of these facilities over time. So we had to rely on the Department of City Planning facilities data, the FMS data on contract, and a list of homeless shelter that DHS gave it to us some years ago. So we were able to, we were able to go back to 2010, and going back to 2010 gave us sufficient number of shelters and sales around these shelters to allow us to study if there are any price differences of homes close to these shelters and homes further away. So our study is focused on congregate shelter in Manhattan that has been operational since 2010.
Why was it limited to Manhattan?
Why is it?
Why was it limited to Manhattan?
So
Manhattan Borough President requested.
Manhattan Borough President requested. Yes, the Manhattan Borough President requested, and also were able to find enough sales around these Manhattan shelters to be able to look at it.
But when you may be talking about this in a minute, but sales means condo sales.
Yes.
We'll
So
get there in a
we will
moment.
get that. We will get to that. Yes. So we looked at sales of homes that are within 1,000 feet of the shelter, which is approximately equal to 3 to 4 north-south Manhattan block. And why within 1,000 feet? Because we believe that within 1,000 feet radius, neighborhood effects are equivalent. What we mean by that is that, the transportation options, shopping options, park options, amenities are equivalently different within 1,000 feet radius. So what we did was that we compared prices that are within 500 feet of an existing shelter to prices that are within 500 but 1,000 feet away from an existing shelter. So what the question we wanted to answer was that if we control for the other factors that explain, home price variations, do we see any price differences between homes that are in this radius, which is 500 feet away from the shelter, the X's, and a comparable home that are in this radius, the Y, which is 1,000 feet away from the shelter? We didn't want to compare the X's to the Z's because we think that for these two neighborhoods, the economic forces may be different from each other. So this table here shows the number of congregate shelters in Manhattan that we were able to confirm that they've been operational since 2010. So out of the 70 total congregate shelters in Manhattan, we're able to confirm that 39 of the 70 has been operational since 2010. So the capacity here measures the number of people that are housed in these shelters. And as you can see, the Families with Children shelter house more people. And also there's a lot of variation, even in the adults only shelters. So it's some of the facilities for the adult shelters range as low as 25 people to as high as 850 people. So we looked at, back to your question, so we look at sales of 1, 2, 3 family homes and condos that are within 1,000 feet of the 39 shelters. We're able to confirm that they've been operational since 2010. So we excluded co-ops because we do not have very good data on the size of the apartments of the co-ops. It's one limitation. So about 82% of the sales were in condo in elevator buildings. In all, about 93% of the sales were actually condos, and 7% were 1, 2, 3 or family homes. So we used the consumer price index to adjust the home sale, the prices of the homes to December 2018. So this table here shows the number of sales that we were able to, the number of sales that were 1,000 feet away, 1,000 feet radius from the 39 congregate shelters. So there were about 6,200 sales in total in our sample, and over half of the sales were within 1,000 feet of an adult shelter, about 28% of the sales were within 500 feet of these two shelters, and about 16% of the sales were close to multiple shelters. There were also about 400 sales that were within 500 feet of one of these two shelters and close to another shelter.
I have a question. My geometry is terrible.
Yes.
So what I'm wondering is you have way more in the 500 to 1,000 foot
Yes.
donut.
Yes.
Is that a bigger area so that you would expect more sales?
Yes, it's a bigger area.
Okay.
Yes.
How many different neighborhoods were impacted with the sales within 1,000 feet of more than one shelter?
There are a lot of about, I think, 15 neighborhoods. Most of the sales that had, multiple shelters were in West Harlem.
Yeah.
Because that's where a lot of the shelters are. About 10 of the 39 shelters are actually in that region. So most of the sales that had multiple shelters close to it were in that region. So
Were there any that were below 96th Street?
Yes, actually there were some in East Village also. Yeah. So they basically the distribution of these shelters are from Hamilton Heights to East Village. They're all over the city.
But you just said most of it was in West Harlem.
About 10 in West Harlem.
The number of sales with multiple shelter within 1,000 feet is relatively small. It's a small. It's 400 out of the 6,700.
Right, but my point is that most of that is happening
Yeah.
in certain neighborhoods.
Yes.
And it's not distributed across Manhattan.
No.
Well, most of the sales actually happen in Midtown East and Upper West Side.
No, but I mean in terms of the multiple.
The multiple, yes, it's there.
Because those are the ones that are getting hit the worst.
Yes, yes, those were in West Harlem actually. So this table here shows the distribution of sale prices. Basically, the 6,200 sales. It shows the distribution of that sales around the 39 shelters. So I want us to look at the median. So these are the numbers before we've accounted for any of the factors that shows the variation of sales prices. So if you look at the adults-only shelter, the median values of homes that are within 500 feet of the shelter is not that different for median for the median value of homes that are from 500 feet to 1,000 feet of the shelter. And if we look at families with children, the median of homes that are actually close to the families with children shelter is actually higher than the median of homes that are from 500 feet to 1,000 feet away. So we know that several factors account for home price variation. So we modeled home price as a function of property characteristics such as size, type. So are you an elevator condo? Are you a worker condo? Are you a 1 to 2 family, 3 family home? A year of sale, and also neighborhood characteristics. So by using the census tract, we hope to basically capture all the different neighborhood types, all the different neighborhood types and amenities in the neighborhoods that helps explain the variation in home prices. We also accounted for the median income in the neighborhood. So all the variables in blue are the variables that actually ended up being part of the final model. The other variables are variables that we tested, but we did not find it important in explaining the variation in home prices. So we also look at some shelter measures, the type of shelter. Are you a shelter that is used to house only adults, or are you a shelter that is used to house families with children? We also look at shelter capacity, which basically captures, how many people are in that particular shelter. We also look at proximity measures. Are you within 500 feet of the shelter? Are you within 600 feet of the shelter? Are you close to more than one shelter? We also look at, are you in the same block of the shelter, or are you on the same side of the street of the shelter? But we didn't have enough of those type of sales to be able to draw any meaningful inference from that. So after accounting for the other factors that help explain home price variation, we found that homes within 500 feet of an adult shelter sold for about 70% less than homes that are within 500 feet but 1,000 feet away from an adult shelter. And homes that are within 500 feet of families with children's shelter sold for about 6% less than homes that are within 500, about beyond 500 but less than 1,000 feet of the shelter. So one of our most important findings is that if you are close to multiple shelters, you were sold for about 17% less. So we...
Sorry, can you just go back 2 slides? One more. Okay.
So I have a question for
Sure.
you, and I wouldn't know how to answer this myself, but are you worried about the fact that shelters are not placed randomly in the city?
Yes.
They're related to all of those independent things that you are trying to test for.
Yes. So that's why we provide, you know, so you're 100% right that initially where the shelter is placed is not random. So there's a sort of like endogeneity part of it, yes. But because we don't have information about when the shelters actually started, it's very hard for us to go back and say, you know, what are the circumstances or what are, you know, like neighborhood demographics or neighborhood differences between where the shelter was placed and the surrounding neighborhood. That's why we provided, you know,
I don't know how you'd fix this either.
Yes. That's why we provided, you know, the medians, like what are the median? I know this is after the shelter is there, but if we basically assume that these neighborhoods are bad neighborhoods, are they still bad neighborhoods now? You know, that's why we provide the median, you know, home prices for the shelters, which are really close. If you look at both shelter types, they are not that far different.
They're probably not statistically
and again, all of this is within 1,000 feet,
Right.
which is 3 to 4 blocks in most cases.
Right. Right.
So you're not talking about comparing the Upper East Side with the Bowery.
But I think, just to go back to your median for a second, these are generally placed in, they're not put in neighborhoods that are fully developed, that are highly valuable, they can't find sites. So they're put in neighborhoods where either there's substantial vacancies or there's, and often high rates of gentrification, especially in Manhattan, which is all we looked at. So here you're talking about the median sales prices of units that are $1.5 million that's your median price in neighborhoods that are either already distressed or rapidly gentrifying. So this, and the reason that number I suspect is so high is because you're only looking at condo sales. And I want to, when I read this, the things that popped out to me are the assumption that condo sales are representative of the value impact of co-ops and rentals, which I understand are problematic to get data on, but the vast majority of people live in rental buildings and co-ops, not condos.
But the problem with rentals is, you assume this changes the behavior of purchasers of property. You would have to see the effect through the rents, which then
muted in 100 ways, which we get.
So it's really, we considered that and determined that
Count co-op sales?
So no. We didn't. It's an interesting. So basically, somebody raised that question. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to count the co-op sales within the donuts. You know, here and here. Which is,
I mean, there's not in the sales file, right? You know the size of the building and you know shares, and obviously the shares attributed to an individual.
No shares.
Yeah, you do.
We have shares, but
and the shares vary.
It's not
for a number of reasons that are not directly related to square feet.
Size, yes.
But you could stare at it at least a little bit to see whether floor or position in a line, in a particular line in the building, might explain some of the variation in shares and sort of normalized flat. This is a lot of
No,
work in this
yeah,
stuff, but
we can.
I agree with Tony that including co-op sales, I think, would add a lot of a dimension to this that's of data that's missing right now. That would probably, if it confirmed the findings, more robust, I think. in my opinion.
But isn't it all comparable in the neighborhood? I don't think, you know, I don't think it makes significant difference. I mean, I think that the ultimate findings will still play out. I don't think in Harlem there's a significant amount of co-op versus condos, not the Upper East Side. I mean, most of the development that's happened in home ownership has been basically condos, and that's where the shelters are. You can play around and pretend that it's not, but the rentals, but the rental growth. I mean, if you compare within the community, the rental growth is what it is. I mean, you could say, okay, is the rental growth within 1,000 feet slower than the rental growth in not in 1,000 feet? We could easily get those measures, but the rental growth, I mean, from an apartment standpoint, you know, rents have gone through the roof. This is 2018 numbers.
Yes.
So
yeah.
I mean.
Oh, but 40% of the apartments are now deregulated, so it is some number like that.
Say that again. I can't hear you.
So about 40% of the rental stock is deregulated right now, right? Give or take, probably more in Manhattan. So the non-regulated apartments would potentially show more market reflection than stabilized apartments, which have to go through all the rigmarole of rents. So just to unpack this a little bit, right? So there is a question about co-ops and whether or not you can muddle your way into it. My building, my shares are 5 square footage, so that's not always true. But non-regulated rental apartments should reflect the market force more than for sure like stabilized or rent controlled.
So these are
And
all
you've got more
robustness
units.
checks.
And
And you've got many more units,
And you have many more units.
which is actually turning over, so that you could actually do this study in the context of rental turnover, and it would be statistically perhaps much less uncertain than this.
But with rentals, is the concern the owner or the tenants? Because if rents are actually lower for the tenants.
Well, by the way, that's also true of the owners,
Yeah.
right? This actually could be depressing the property tax bill.
But the renters have a different motivation. They're renting where they can rent, where there's vacancy that they can afford. I don't see. It's not.
They're probably doing a lot less research
Right.
on the neighborhood if you're signing a one-year
They're
lease.
right, and
Much
and,
less.
and I don't know of any bad neighborhoods in Harlem that people don't move into anymore. I mean, this is not 1950. I mean,
So
people go anywhere to an apartment in
all
Manhattan
these questions
and
are
pay almost anything.
robustness checks that we can do. So with the co-op shares, the problem is that, you know, UF doesn't really value co-ops by the apartment. They value co-ops by you know, the entire building. So we don't really have very good sort of information about the size. But we can do something with the shares, for instance. And we it's all going to be part of, you know, the robustness check. You know, do we see this sort of same effects when we consider co-ops, for instance, or when we consider rentals, for instance? Do we see sort of this, you know, price
The
difference?
reason I'm pressing it, and it's a very fair point about the neighborhoods, is, and it gets to your point of, why are we asking this question? If the question is whether very wealthy people who are purchasing expensive condos get slightly less value than there's poor people nearby, okay, maybe we have shown this very modest effect, actually, 6 or 7%. There's not very big, until you've got your hair on fire.
It's modest until you go to sell your apartment.
25-year leasing apartment, I'll buy it because I can't afford the boot. But if the, and I get that was the narrow answer, and that's why everybody got all upset about it. But the bigger question is, you know, what are these shelters doing to neighborhoods? And if the answer is really that rental prices aren't changing very much if you do rentals, and that co-op prices are changing about this or less, and that it turned out that it is a, you know, maybe more muted than 6%, maybe it turns out net to everybody it's 2 equivalent, then I think you begin to tell a different story, which is actually when you put the shelter in, it doesn't crash the neighborhood.
Yeah, and what you're really saying, I think, is that you've selected for the most speculative, most sensitive, most limited in actual numbers group of properties you could designate in your impact zones. And you know, you come up with this, oh my goodness, I mean, they're selling your apartment and it's going to get 17% less. I mean, this is shocking. But you know, it's the whole sort of speculation of these neighborhoods and time and how much did you pay for it, and you probably made a killing anyway, even if you're 17% below where you should be, you think. I don't know I don't know where this reliably takes you.
What did Gail think she was actually asking? What was she actually asking?
Did she not want she wanted a reason to encourage more supportive housing, didn't she?
I don't know.
I don't know.
We can't ascribe what her motivation was per se, you know?
Yeah, I'm guessing, but it's not, yeah, anyway.
But
That's certainly what she said in response.
Housing
This points
that
to
was
need
more
for it.
affordable. So more on the lower end in the mix.
But I think this shows that affordable housing in and of itself doesn't decrease values. The issue is where's the 17% is not something to say, oh, too bad. I disagree with that entirely. 6% maybe you can say, okay, that's fine. But the problem is, are you, for neighborhoods that are emerging where you have high minority ownership, are you disenfranchising their values, right? That they could then sell, right? Because most of their value of their wealth is in their home, and they're now getting hit 17% because of decisions that have been made about where people are going to put shelters in their neighborhoods. That to me seems like a problem, and I think that the report should talk about that.
That was the point that I was actually going to go to, which is that if there's a question about wealth accumulation differentials in neighborhoods, which there clearly is, and citing of not just shelters but a whole bunch of other facilities impacts home values, that further impacts the disparity in wealth accumulation amongst neighborhoods. And it seems like that's another step possibly to pursue, and whatever, setting aside whatever Gail may have been actually asking or thought she was getting at, you know, there's an issue we hear about that I'm not sure there's a big literature on that I'm familiar with at all that's worth.
I think also it's interesting to look at, do any of the congregant shelters, are they all run by the city?
No, they have providers. They contracted out. Oh, she's
very few run
she's
by
a resident
run
expert.
directly by the city. Most of them are contracted out to service providers.
So is there any? So one of the things that's interesting to me, like the report, I participated in the scattered site program, quite successful, and so obviously one of the issues in that, one of the things that you pointed out is that it's just like an apartment building, right? Mm-hmm. And there's limitations on how many people you can put per building into the buildings. But for the most part, the congregate housing I thought was, essentially one whole population, and so it feels different, and the operations of the building feels different. And the city is historically not the greatest landlord. I don't think that's controversial. So maybe there's some study that talks about the effect of if it's city run versus not. Is it city run in certain neighborhoods versus not other neighborhoods? And is there a different value impact there? I don't. That to me could squeak out the data a little bit better.
I would ask on that point too, not just to distinguish is it contracted or directly run, but what else is there? Because we know there's greater stability when there are services present in shelter, and not all shelter providers actually have a host of services that mirror kind of what you get at supportive housing.
Not all city contracts pay for shelter.
That is true.
And I think there's a lot of variation. Between shelters.
That's a good point.
I have a question about your choice of independent variables, because I betcha that census tract is sucking up everything in all those other kinds of.
It's a kind of fixed effect.
It's a fixed effect, and you're sucking up the share that's below poverty level and race, and all that other stuff that
Yes.
might be
That's why the rest of it's-
in some ways more interesting than the census tract.
Yes.
And you might be better off using those instead of the census tract.
Yeah, so we basically, so we use that without the census tract, but using the census tract, actually, the R squared and the root mean squared, so the model is a better fit than. I understand that it captures everything, and we basically use some of these, and we had, interesting coefficients for these variables also.
And I wonder if they interact with your distance variable in interesting ways, and you can't find that out unless you have that.
We tried a lot of models.
So maybe the R squared is not the most important thing that's going on.
And you probably have some weird lines, right? You probably have census tracts that intersect your donuts, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, there are a lot of them.
I hate it when a census tract intersects with
That would still be true of all those other independent.
Yeah, right, because you're gonna get them at the, you're gonna observe them at the census tract level.
Is this just looking at congregate shelter, didn't look at hotels?
So we were not, so there are congregate hotels too, as I said in the other slide. So there are congregate hotels, but we were not able to confirm that any of these 28 congregate hotels have been operational since 2010.
Because it would be really, since we're desperately trying to get out of hotels, it would be interesting to do something.
Yeah,
that's
but
looking-
But
we
not
could-
out of those hotels.
we couldn't.
It's out of the
Out of
Right.
these hotels. So these hotels are basically, they are shelter on
Right.
its own. Like the city is essentially
Right.
using every room. You can't go there and rent a room there. The city is using everything 100%. But we were not able to confirm that any of these 28 shelters have been operational
So
since.
the use of hotels, right? Not the like regular hotels where you could if you were so inclined rent a room as a tourist, has risen very dramatically.
Yes.
And despite their protests, has not declined that much.
Right, and we're hemorrhaging money on it.
And
But
it's
but the numbers don't include the like the cluster sites and the hotels, like right?
Yeah,
It
no.
shouldn't.
No.
But
Yeah.
I guarantee though, if you did it just on the cluster sites, it would have no impact.
Yes.
No down impact on the neighborhood at all. I mean, I
wouldn't even
have
know they
my
were
own
shelters.
properties, and and there's services attached to those units and all of that.
Well,
So
the thing about the cluster site is that they are basically dispersed all over the city. So we have some of the units, the city is only renting one apartment. So in that case, I mean, no, people living in the apartment complex wouldn't even feel that, this person is a homeless person or whatever.
sometimes.
Yeah.
But you're right. I think the impact is low.
it's-
But is that 140 something? Was that all Manhattan? Or was that throughout the city? Because we had a tough time finding stuff in Manhattan for sure. The number of the
560.
Oh, 560 is
Yeah,
the
that-
entire city.
That's the entire city.
That is it. So basically, it includes
147 is the entire city.
No, yeah, cluster site is the entire city.
So I would imagine that if that's the entire city, the probably very low percentage of that is Manhattan.
I think that
Very almost of it were in Bronx,
Right.
actually.
Right. So
Most of it were in
the
Bronx.
cluster sites.
Yes.
Well, because that's where the city could fund them.
Most of it were in Bronx.
Right. But does that include also? There's initiatives through HPD now to include a homeless requirement within the financing that they're doing in affordable housing.
Well, this is basically the list that DHS sent us. DHS
Right.
sent us, well, these are all the facilities or homes or whatever we have available to house.
Those aren't temporary shelter though, those are permanent housing.
Right, but that's more like the cluster sites. Oh, I see what you're saying.
This is all temporary.
No, but what happens is that my understanding of cluster sites is that I have a contract with the service provider. The service provider can put somebody in that's ready for permanent housing, but then the lease is under the service provider, so if that person turns out to not be ready, whatever, they can take them out. So I don't know what does that count as? Permanent?
I think that's still considered temporary.
Temporary. Okay.
They don't individually have a lease.
Say it one more time.
They don't individually have a lease.
I think they might have a lease. I gotta go and check how it works. I can
It's
let
not
you
an
know.
exit where you get like a link voucher.
But
You rent your own
the service provider is really the one controlling the housing.
Yes.
But they also provide services. Like for me, I'm not qualified to do that, but they would provide it to the tenant.
Yes, some
and-
do provide services.
Right, and
Wayne
She's-
is, maybe.
she's the best
The city asked, we couldn't find a space.
So we also, increased the radius around the shelters to 600 feet, and for adult shelter, the price differences actually decreases from 7.1 to 4.5%. And for the children with shelter, family with children shelter, the price differences decreases from 6.4 to 3.9. So if basically the price differences keep on shrinking as you increase the radius around the shelter. For about 800 feet radius, we don't see any sort of price differences at all. So it means that, as you move away from the shelter, doesn't seem to be, we don't see any price differences at all. But the most important thing is that if you're close to multiple shelters, it still seems to matter a lot.
Is there ever a stabilizing effect of actually taking over a building for the shelter system? Or is there so much competition at this point for any real estate that there's always another viable contender for the property that the city manages to get its fingers on for the shelter? I would think that might be true in boom times, but I would wonder if you go back and you look at the neighborhood before you establish the shelter, whatever, whether there aren't cases where actually the shelter at least occupied what might otherwise be virtually a derelict building, which isn't very good for the neighborhood either.
It's possible. It could be. If we had the data, we would have done that.
Well, in effect, I think some of what Furman found in their study of supportive housing, which admittedly is a different thing, was, those supportive housing facilities were going into neighborhoods that were deteriorating, and actually putting it in helped to stabilize it. And that's why the ability to get a before and after, to look at the differentials in prices over time, is is going to be the gold standard in how to do this.
Well, but I don't agree with that analysis.
The non-existent records of when it became a shelter would be interesting.
Right, but that analysis is not correct. I mean, the city was putting shelters where they had land, and they had land in these areas. And the truth is not that that doesn't prove that it's stabilizing neighborhoods. The bottom line is now we're looking at what is happening to those neighborhoods now that those institutions are there, and what's it doing to the population of people who own houses in those neighborhoods. I mean, that's the critical idea. I mean, obviously New York has changed tremendously. I grew up in New York in the 80s and 90s. Very different now than when my kids are running around, in Harlem now. So, but the truth is that, the dynamics of those neighborhoods and what's happening now when there are the shelters there is what's relevant, right? Not what happened back in the 80s when you decided to put it there.
Maybe it's because people are very old. Not like Mark, but more like me. Think back about full cycles.
Yeah.
And the question is, right now we can barely remember the bust. But when there was a bust, and whether it was in the 70s or even more recently, the question is, does a stream of payment into a building that would otherwise be dramatically weakened economically in its competitive position somehow support? And I think that's not true now, for sure. It's ridiculous now.
If you go back enough, the fact of the matter is the reason the city owned the property is that private ownership for that unit collapsed. And often the city ended up owning the property, and it was just as much of a mess, if not more so, under city ownership as it had been under private ownership. And, I guess we're on too long. I agree with you. I mean, really, so what? I mean, what happens going forward? Because that's the only thing that you really have anything to do with. But on a larger focus, I mean, there's probably been some benefit to the shelter investment just as a way of stabilizing derelict housing stock. But I agree with you that although it intellectually may be interesting, I mean, at this point, so what? Because what matters to people is what happens tomorrow, not what happened last week. Last week's done.
But also, from an economic standpoint, the movement of people up into areas that are derelict was because of the fact that there was no housing anywhere else. So, the movement to gentrification doesn't come because you stabilize and put a shelter there. It's because there's nowhere else for them to afford in, you know, prime Manhattan. And so that's what's driven gentrification. So whether that place was going to be empty or not, I think, you know, if you left it empty, it probably would be fully developed at this point because there's nowhere else for folks who want to pay a certain price to live. And they'd rather live in Manhattan than live somewhere else. And so that's, in essence, what's happened in New York. But, I mean, you could debate it, it's interesting, but, you know, that's my understanding.
I mean, your perspective is very much a housing boom. And that is the reality of where we are.
And affordability
crisis
crisis that we have.
Yeah.
I mean, the affordability crisis is really what's the issue.
But remember that, you know, the period we're studying here is 2010 to 2018. So
Which is pathetically short, quite honestly.
And characterized by one direction of
right. No,
there's no cycle here.
Yeah, no,
No
and
cycle.
we're not pretending that there's a cycle.
No,
I mean,
no cycle at all.
you know, the Furman study, I think someone asked, you know, could you go back and look at least to 2014 to 2018, and we could do that if they actually produce a list for us. But the Furman study went over something like a 20 or 25 year period. So, you know, they really were able to capture the effect of some of the longer effects.
So I mean, just from an IBO perspective, you know, the reports out there, you know, as you said, some people jumped up and down because it didn't align with what we wanted to say, and so we get all that, and you got to say what you got to say. But it would be interesting, you know, sort of sequel to this, if you get that data, if you're able to incorporate some of the non-regulated rental units, if you're able to figure out a strategy on the co-ops, if those numbers in any way begin to mute some of these variables, as a few hundred feet, you're going to get to a point where, for most of those units, it's going to turn out potentially to be, instead of 5, 6, maybe it's 3, 4%. And at some point, the headline has to be different, which is, you know, the siting of these shelters has a de minimis impact on the value of real estate.
It would also help if, for example, the New York Times led with not only the 17%, they somehow took 25% impact, and that's their first story on it. Citing a shelter reduces your value by 25%.
Or the story could have been, if you're 800 feet away from a shelter, you're really not, there's no impact, according to the study.
So,
but that's a less enticing story from their vantage point, so.
Well, yeah.
Thank God they're not a tabloid.
I mean, but, you know, homelessness in general isn't particularly good for neighborhoods. I mean, if you have a tremendous population living in the street in your neighborhood, that's not great either. I mean, there are so many dimensions that actually matter to the conclusion you're coming to, other than the 25% that the Times thinks is, you know, it doesn't take a lot of reporting of people, and it gets you column inches and a headline.
And look, the fact is the fastest growth in the shelter population, as you pointed out, was in singles. Those singles could well be on the street. Los Angeles has 75% of its homeless people live on the street. We have 3,000 out of 75,000 on the street.
Right.
So we don't have any homeless people on the street. We have it, obviously. I'm not saying we don't have it, but anywhere near the
It's not a tent city.
Right. We don't have tent city. We don't have any of that. We don't have San Francisco, LA, Washington, Seattle. We don't have any of those. And the reason is, first, we spend $2 billion. Thank God Mark wasn't my budget director.
And there's a court order.
And there's a court order and a right to shut. So for all those reasons, we don't have that problem. And that's what will really crash values. It's tent cities lined up. It's not.
So you're saying, Tony, we're spending money to support housing values?
That's the right story. That's the stringer story.
Wait, has Gail done anything with this report since it's come out?
She issued a statement, and that's it.
She issued a statement?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, just, you know, you're basically spending money for social order. And that, I mean, order in neighborhoods in general is extremely helpful to value. I mean, if people feel reasonably safe in the street, that makes a tremendous difference. You look around neighborhoods in Brooklyn over the last 30 or 40 years, and it's just, I mean, the contrast that, among other things, just security and the reduction in active crime in many neighborhoods, not all of them, has had a huge effect on real estate value.
Absolutely.
So it is 10 o'clock. It might be a good moment to end on a point of agreement. We can adjourn the meeting, but we can also, for people who want to discuss it further, are welcome to stick around and we can do that. But
We need a motion to adjourn? All in favor?
okay, I think it sounded like that. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.
We've got a lot to think about.
Thank you.